and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Juliet Golding. Now, we are doing a series reading our way through Lord of the Rings, and we have reached Chapter 5 in Book 4. That's the latter half of the Two Towers. And this chapter is called The Window on the West. And I'm having a look at it from the point of view of the authorial tricks and of the trade in this story as opposed to the deep history of Middle-earth. Anyway, so let's get on. This is an unusual chapter in many ways because basically it's one extended conversation held in 3 locations. And that is a conversation between Faramir, Frodo and Sam. And the excitement is not the excitement of set-piece battles like in the previous chapter where we had the skirmish and the first glimpse of an Olifant. Nothing like that. Here the tension is in the battle of wits. Who is going to make a mistake? Who's going to slip up? Who's going to make the wrong choice? And it's really the chapter where Faramir bursts onto the scene in Middle-earth and becomes, well, one of many people's favourite characters. Tolkien said he felt he was most like Faramir, except he didn't have the courage of his characters. I'm not so sure. I think Tolkien showed himself to be a man of courage, but we'll allow him his own self, his own humility in that case. So there is a lot of wisdom that is the kind of wisdom that Tolkien himself espoused. He feels he identifies with Faramir's worldview. And I think we can see that as this chapter goes on. And in thinking about looking at this from the author's point of view, if you're writing a book, it might be that there's a character in there which surprises you as being the one that is closest to you. In a way, all your characters are you, of course. But the Tolkien strategy of having not a major character, but one of the important ones, sort of a second-rank character, shall we say, being closest to his worldview is an interesting strategy. It stops it being too didactic because you can get your worldview, your sort of thoughts across without it dominating. It's sort of the atmosphere of the novel, I should say, rather than a message carried by the novel, that men like Faramir can exist in this world. So it starts with something like, it's the closest we get to return to the Council of Elrond, or maybe a little bit like the incident where Aragorn, Gimli and Legolas are sort of first encounter the men of Rohan and Éomer and have to explain themselves. And note that we are in Sam's point of view, and we're starting in the middle of the thing, because Tolkien has used the strategy that many of us use, that Sam has been asleep. He wakes up and he finds a lot of the boring introductory stuff is done, so we can go straight into the heart of the matter. It's a good idea. Here we get another description of Faramir. We've met him briefly in the previous chapter, but now he's unmasked. And I was interested to see how Tolkien describes him. It's not to do with what he looks like. It's actually what he feels like, what impact he makes on people around him. His face, it was stern and commanding, and a keen wit lay behind his searching gaze. And that's really the key to his character and what he's going to show us in this extended conversation. And we can see his wit as in not witty remarks, not that kind of wit, but wit as in cleverness, intelligence, the grasp of a situation as he puzzles through what Isildur's Bane might be. If you go all the way back to the Council of Elrond, he is mentioned so briefly in passing as Boromir says that the dream, there's a song, the poem, first came to his brother and then to Boromir. And so here we've got that long narrative thread being picked up again. And Frodo is really forced on the back foot, and he's doing some careful defensive play here, hitting back across the net, or it's more like he's on defense in this sword match. trying to give enough truthful information without betraying his real purpose for being there. And during the course of that, he mentions that Aragorn was in charge of the company and talks of his lineage. And here we get a division in Faramir's company. We got some of them saying, oh, this is great tidings. Remember, these are the southern Dunedain, a lot of these people, for whom Aragorn may have been, as leader of the northern Dunedain, a sort of a bigger deal in many ways, because they understand his power and where it comes from. But to someone like Faramir, who is the son of the steward of Gondor, who has been ruling in the place of the king, obviously it's a threat. And we can imagine that Faramir might turn out to be a good person in the way he reacts, but still it's a threat to his future. That after many, many years, centuries of there never being a king, Aragorn is coming. I think that Tolkien knows how Faramir is going to react, but he holds it back. This is one of those times where you hold back from telling your reader, because he says here that Faramir's face was unmoved. Not Faramir himself, but just his face. He's got a good poker face, to use that comparison. And why does he do this? It's to keep the tension. Because if we get access at this point to Faramir's thoughts, internal thoughts, and we're not inside Faramir's point of view, we're only hearing what he says, which gives us a clue to it. But if he's really thinking, I'm never going to challenge the real king when he comes, that takes away all the tension. Don't do that. Leave things hidden so that Aragorn's return to Minas Tirith has some tension. They don't just open the doors and let him in. One of the things in this chapter which I wanted to highlight is how Frodo is characterized. Here you need to delete your Elijah Wood version of Frodo. Here we have what is effectively Sam's commanding officer, the head of his little squad, who have gone out on this dangerous mission, standing up for himself and his mission and his right to hold back information from another figure in command. And remember, we're in Sam's point of view initially. Sam has pride in Frodo for the way Frodo stands up for himself. And Frodo is actually a very good arguer in this passage. He says, yet those who claim to oppose the enemy would do well not to hinder it being his mission. So he's hinting and he's saying, if you're a friend on the right side here, you're not going to stand in my way. But in this rally, which is where the tension comes from and the excitement, I love this chapter for just the way this long conversation unfolds. Faramir has an amazing drop shot. Were you a friend of Boromir? And interestingly, at this point, Tolkien chooses to throw us very abruptly to being inside Frodo's point of view. From having looked at him from the outside from Sam, we're suddenly with Frodo. And there's this phrase, vividly before Frodo's mind came the memory of Boromir's assault upon him. And for a moment, he hesitated. That abruptness, I think, is on purpose because it makes us feel a shadow of the shock, the trauma that Frodo is still experiencing there. So that's an effective shift in our point of view to bring that home. And the bottom half of page 272, if you're following in the 3-volume version, you get a really good sense of the hidden agendas and the explicit agendas in the interplay between Frodo and Faramir. Because Faramir sort of keeps laying out breadcrumbs for Frodo to sort of take, and then Frodo sort of thinks, oh, hang on, there's a trap here. So I'll read you a little bit. It says, then you would grieve to learn that Boromir is dead. I would grieve indeed, said Frodo. Then catching the look in Faramir's eyes, he faltered. Dead? He said. Do you mean that he is dead and that you knew it? That you've been trying to trap me in words, playing with me? Are you now trying to snare me with falsehoods? So there is this tussle going on at deeper levels in this conversation. And we'll see that Faramir catches Frodo out again. He keeps laying these traps. And the reason he's doing this is because he is in command of this secret base, and he has to know how much he needs to risk with this stranger who suddenly appeared, which priority he should be following. Frodo's missional priority or his own standing orders to defend this base at all cost. Anyway, so we got this sword fight going on, verbal sword fight, between Faramir and Frodo, and then Sam breaks in. It's done as a line break to emphasize that we're in sort of phases of conversation. And he sort of bursts in saying, "See here, Captain," and goes on to sort of stand before him. He brings the Shire authority to what is actually Gondor authority. He gets slapped down for that, gently, because this is Faramir, but it's still a lovely moment which many of us will remember, where he's described as, he planted himself squarely in front of Faramir, his hands on his hips and a look on his face as if he was addressing a young hobbit who had offered him what he called sauce when questioned about visits to the orchard. So with Sam, we're always going back to the Shire and to the homely world, which gives this sense of the grounding of his character. He actually makes an effective argument. He's basically saying, you'll be doing the work of the enemy if you stand in our way. If you think we've murdered Boromir, you've got another thing coming. That's the sort of the burden of what he's saying. He does get pushed back by Faramir because Faramir knows that the sort of negotiation is really with Frodo. And actually, Faramir is a bit unfair saying that Frodo has more wit than Sam. But I suppose what he means by that is Frodo is more aware of the cross currents in this conversation than Sam is. The other way that this chapter has a sort of tension and excitement is the well-placed revelations. So we've got the sort of the sense of Faramir getting closer and closer to what Isildur's Bane might be, but we also have sudden moments where he says things which change everybody's understanding of what's going on. And the first of those here is, Boromir was my brother. So immediately, Frodo, who's been traumatized by his relationship with Boromir, is thrown back so that what he thought he knew about this person he's just met, he is now beginning to doubt. And he's looking at Faramir trying to judge him, just as this is a two-way judging process. What he says he likes, he judges Faramir as being less self-regarding but sterner and wiser than Boromir, but he still can't fully trust him. And like any good spy in enemy territory, he's not going to give up his secrets easily. So this leads us on to Faramir's, what I would call a poetic account of his vision of Boromir. If you've watched the Peter Jackson films, the extended versions, there is a kind of, he tries to do this. He does it in a kind of dreamlike sequence where you see Faramir thinking back. It's paying homage to this section, but I would say that this is one which is really worth reading because it feels like a piece of translated Anglo-Saxon poetry. And particularly, there is a series of laments that break into it that feel like within that form, a lament for a fallen warrior. And it's got the most beautiful cadence. So it starts with after the sort of the telling of how the sort of chronology of when he heard the horn and all that kind of thing. He then says, this is Faramir, I sat at night by the waters of Anduin in the grey dark under the young pale moon, watching the ever-moving stream, and the sad reeds were rustling. Now that's in no way realistic dialogue. We're not in the world of realism in that sense. We're in the world of poetry, poetic speech. Because if he was just having a conversation to get to the point, he would say, well, I was by the river Anduin among the reeds. Cut out all the poetic language. But no, this is about casting a literary spell, a sort of atmosphere and the sense of the majesty of this world. And it goes on. That night all the world slept at the midnight hour. Then I saw, or it seemed that I saw, a boat floating on the water, glimmering grey, a small boat of a strange fashion with a high prow, but there was none to row or steer it. And he goes on and describes seeing Boromir in this boat, including things which he could not have known in advance, how he was dressed and the Lorien belt. And this is where you get the lament. Boromir, I cried, where is thy horn? Whither goest thou, O Boromir? But he was gone. It reminds me of Lewis saying how he fell in love with northern stories by coming across the phrase, the lament for Balder, oh, Balder is dead, even though he didn't know who that character was. There's an element of the echo here, I think. And the passage then concludes with this wonderful cadence which takes us out to sea. And I do not doubt that he is dead and has passed down the river to the sea. It's probably only somebody so steeped in that kind of literature could write something like that. It feels like a song. And it's noteworthy that he gives it to Faramir to say this. You would expect it from an elf or something like that, but this character is the most elven of men, or as Sam says, most wizardly of men. And so he's being characterized through his speech here, which is actually something that Jane Austen does particularly brilliantly, but not this kind of character. And we get a line break after this, what is a set piece, in order to sort of say, well, that was that kind of register, and now we're moving on. We note here that when they go on to discuss that they've come out of Lorien, when Frodo explains where the belt comes from, that Faramir actually calls Lorien by its old name, Lorelindorinan, which those of you who are following along will remember that's Treebeard who used that name. And like Treebeard, Faramir is not going to make a hasty judgment. So he's in that set of people who take their time. Fortunately, not quite as long as an Ent. There is an interesting little, there's several phrases that pop up out of this conversation, which I think have wider, interesting applications to the whole book. One is a discussion about, was what he saw like a dream or an artifice or a vision or something like that? Faramir says it wasn't evil, for his works, for Sauron's works, filled the heart with loathing, but my heart was filled with grief and pity. And I think this is something which both Tolkien and Lewis understood about works of art, that they have a sort of imprint that they leave on the reader. And one of the reasons why so many of us love Narnia, Middle-earth, is the imprint they leave is one that is of, in the case of Middle-earth, this sort of longing and this grief and this pity, sort of the greatness of the characters within it. Perhaps one of the reasons why subsequent fantasy works don't attach in the same way is they don't have quite that power. There may be some that slip through and do leave that impression. I mean, Harry Potter, for example, does also have the idea of a sort of, as well as the whimsy, there's a sense of the greatness of sacrifice and a slightly sort of sour understanding of the sacrifices that you have to make in order to defeat evil. There's some interesting aftertaste left by Harry Potter. But anyway, going back to Middle-earth, I think that this grief and pity is actually something that Tolkien meant his work to do. So it's not it's not a work of Sauron, it's a work of the good, which we obviously knew already. And he goes back as well to using the italics to sort of give his lament here. Isildur's Bane is italicized, and exclamations of sadness are also italicized. Yes, he says, Boromir, oh Boromir, what did she say to you, the lady that dies not? I think that is a sort of express a sort of heightened speech not addressed to the people in the room with him. It's a peculiar, I think, to this conversation, but noteworthy because Tolkien is using it to set this conversation apart. This is very different from the film version. If you come at Faramir from the film version, you find a much coarser, weaker younger brother here. But actually, the Faramir here is already a man of mature judgments and learning. So he doesn't do such a big character arc. The film does that in order to give him a bigger character arc so that there is more drama in the decision. They actually have it with Faramir taking Frodo and Sam to Osgiliath. That doesn't happen. Here, his decisions are all taken quite early on, and so he decides to trust Frodo, and then he's trying to work out, well, what do I now do with him? What is best? I've got to use my judgment. I can't just accept what Frodo's saying about himself. So it doesn't have that cruelty. There's no beating up of Gollum or anything like that in this story. It's a softer version of Faramir. I prefer this one because it seems as though he's a nobler character in the book than he is in the film. He does get there in the film, but it takes a jaunt before he does. And as they carry on with their sparring, they move to a different phase, which is when they're walking along together. And Faramir returns to the subject of Boromir. And he says, "You were not wholly frank with me, Frodo." And Frodo has a very good comeback, which is, "I told no lies, and of the truth all I could." But Faramir he's like a really great detective, in fact. He's like the Hercule Poirot of Middle-earth because he puts together what he knows about the character of his brother and the signs and what he's read in the archives and what he knows of Gandalf and so on. He says, Isildur's Bane lay between you. Such things do not breed peace among confederates, not if aught may be learned from ancient tales. Here there is a sort of link to the Silmarillion, which is all about the kinstrife that happened as a result of heirlooms, Fëanor's jewels. So remember, Silmarillion isn't published at this point when Tolkien's publishing Lord of the Rings. It's that sense of the depth of the story that you can then go on to learn about. But Faramir has clearly been reading the right tales because he knows. But Faramir is not only showing that he knows his history, he is also getting answers by gently pushing Frodo to defend accuracy. And Frodo says, it wasn't the company that was the problem. And Faramir is, it is as I thought, your trouble was with Boromir alone. He knows his brother. And he goes on to say that he thinks that Boromir died well, achieving some good thing because of the way he appeared in death. There is a mercy in this world. You can redeem yourself. Boromir redeems himself. But gives Faramir a chance to set up what is going to be Pippin's meeting with Denethor. So while we're getting some interesting material here, I think Tolkien contemplated moving some of it into the appendices. But still, it really sets up what happens when Gandalf and Pippin arrive in Minas Tirith, because Faramir goes into some detail about the line of stewards and how Boromir was frustrated by still being a steward and not a king. And Frodo says, well, he seemed to accept Aragorn. And this is where Faramir shows he loved his brother, but he knew him inside out. He said the pinch had not yet come. He anticipates that if Boromir was still alive, he would actually end up fighting for the rule of Gondor. she's a fate that was spared by him dying so early on in the narrative. And another, there's so much in this chapter to delight those of us who follow all these sort of highways and byways. We get a sort of extended little bit about Gandalf, because one of the reasons why Faramir knows all of this is he's been a pupil when he could of Mithrandir. And here we get, I'd actually forgotten until I read it here that it's Faramir the one who says this, the one who remembers. We get the names of Gandalf. Mithrandir among the elves, Thalcún to the dwarves, Olorin I was in my youth in the west that is forgotten, in the south, in Carnus, in the north, Gandalf, to the east I go not. The companion to The Lord of the Rings has some very interesting little section about this. You can also read about this if you want to get a sort of Tolkien version in the Unfinished Tales in the Istari section. So do go digging, because it's some delightful little facts and figures about what Gandalf exactly is. But Faramir not only knows Gandalf's names, he's astute, because he says that Gandalf was more than a lore master. He was a great mover of the deeds done in our time. And he is linking us back here. One of the images I've used for Lord of the Rings is, and the way it sort of bears study, is the way that different parts of the narrative sew their way back to an earlier section. It's like this great weave that's going on. And here we're back in the Shadows of the Past, where we hear that Gandalf had gone to the archives of Minas Tirith and found the account of what Isildur did after the battle. And we get the sort of Minas Tirith end of it, of Faramir watching Gandalf do that research. So it sort of connects us to where we came from. And so Faramir understands what a loss Gandalf is, because he is one of the great movers of deeds done in our time. And then we get the test, the temptation. It's sort of in stages. And here we get Faramir making a sort of vow, because he senses there's something, an heirloom, something like that. He says, "But fear no more. I would not take this thing if it lay by the highway." So he knows it would be bad for Minas Tirith if he took it. And so he would resist the temptation. Lead us not into temptation. And we get Faramir's vision of what the future restored looks like. Again, it's another lovely passage on page 280. He says, "For myself, I would see the white tree in flower again in the courts of the kings, and the silver crown returned, and Minas Tirith in peace. Minas Anor again, as of old, full of light, high and fair, beautiful as a queen among other queens." And he says, in an echo of Galadriel, that he doesn't want her to see Gondor as a mistress of many slaves, not even a kind mistress of willing slaves. That was the language that Galadriel used, that if she took the ring, she would enslave the population. Even if it starts as a benign, loving rule, it would become an evil version of it. I think that some of these lines, and there's another one later on, are transposed to Boromir in the film. You have to watch this out, because sometimes if you watch the film a few times, you start to think, oh, that's a Boromir line. It's a Faramir line. Because when Boromir is talking to Aragorn in Lorien, again, I think it might be extended edition, he talks about, that he wants to see the city restored. So watch out for those. It's a Faramir thought. And then we sort of conclude this little section as they're walking to the hideout with a wonderful piece of wisdom from Tolkien. Again, wisdom given to Faramir. And it's much quoted. "I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend, the city of the men of Númenor." And so on. There are similar thoughts about being in the Second World War and why fight that Tolkien expresses in his letters at the time when he's writing this. So just remember that going on underneath this, Tolkien is in a way working through his reaction to a real world conflict. Why should people fight? Yes, they should stand up for what is right. But you fight for not because you like battle, you fight because of what you're defending. Then we shift back to a quick dip into Sam's point of view, just to catch the reader up on Gollum and hint that he's still with them. When you're plate spinning like this, you've got sort of so many different plot threads to keep going. A little hint of that Gollum's still with them really helps, because that will set up the next chapter. Then we get the approach to the Henneth Annwn lair, and their eyes are bound. Again, we got another of these little threads weaving us back to earlier parts of the narrative. Some of these sort of picaresque novels of earlier times are more like strings of beads, where each individual adventure is its own thing, and they move on to the next adventure, which is its own thing. Tolkien doesn't write like that. His travel is always connected, both backwards and forwards. So the echo of what happens when they approach Lorien, as they're led by the elves into Lorien, is recalled here. He's just sort of saying, remember that? And it recalls, of course, the other characters who have dropped out of sight for half of this book. But the binding also gives us this amazing moment, which is the most beautiful visual moment in this chapter. It's very good to deprive us of one of our sort of senses to heighten the other senses. It happens again in the Shelob's lair, where they lose, it's so dark they can't see. Here it's through having their eyes bound, but they get this experience of just being able to listen and to feel the floor descending and so on, and then being spun round. And then there's a moment of like the curtain opening, and they see where they are. They stood on the wet floor of polished stone, the doorstep, as it were, of a rough-hewn gate of rock, opening dark behind them. But in front, a thin veil of water was hung, so near that Frodo could have put out an outstretched arm into it. It faced westward. The level shafts of the setting sun behind beat upon it, and the red light was broken into many flickering beams of ever-changing colour. It was as if they stood at the window of some elven tower, curtained with threaded jewels of silver and gold and ruby, sapphire and amethyst, all kindled with an unconsuming fire. Now, it's all very subtle here, but one of the images that Tolkien uses about creativity in the poem Mythopoeia is this idea of the split light, that we are fragments passed through like a stained glass window. So the white light, if that's, I don't know, the origin of creativity, it splits through us. And the image of this window on the west, which is like a natural version of a stained glass window, just references subtly that idea of creativity and beauty for me. That's what I think of so we are taken by it into other imagined worlds, an elven tower and so on. Just a beautiful moment. So before the third part of the conversation, we're in a little intermission where the Robin Hood atmosphere of rough and ready hospitality is reasserted. We get Anborn with a hint of Gollum being glimpsed. The idea he might be I think he calls it a black squirrel, but possibly Gollum. And you get the fact that Faramir looks at Frodo and Sam and he's thinking, I think it's your companions, but it's not stated. You don't have to state everything. It's actually fun for your reader to infer. Let your reader feel a bit clever. And we've got Sam forcing himself to stay awake whilst the meal is being set up. And this leads to that sort of lighter moment in this chapter, which is actually, the whole of it is one of those reprieves in the darker material here, where we get the contrast between the customs of Gondor and the Shire, with a misunderstanding about why Sam dunked his head in the water. And we get that bit of Shire wisdom, that doing so is like rain on a wilted lettuce. That's an image totally out of Sam's world. This is one of the things that you might want to consider if you're looking for ways to characterize. Look for the moments when you can refresh old ways of describing something within the language that that person would use. So it's not like a dash of cold water to the face. It's like rain on a wilted lettuce. So it helps create character, but also conveys exactly what that person means. And then there's a moment which straddles page 284 and 285, which is much written about because it is a very rare religious moment. Again, the companion to Lord of the Rings goes into great detail about this. But they have basically what is a grace before the meal, where they all stand and they turn to the west. And Faramir's example says the reason why they do it is we look towards Numenor that was, because Numenor has sunk below the waves, and beyond to Elvenhome that is, and to that which is beyond Elvenhome and will ever be. That is like a Trinitarian. It's got a sort of prayer cadence, hasn't it? Tolkien considered himself writing in an era that's pre-Christian. So his Gondorians are like Egyptians. You know, they're that sort of ancient civilization, pre-Christianity. But they have this intuition about sort of natural form of religion. And this is the moment where you see it. Elvenhome, the Valar, sort of the archangels in this world live there. And beyond that, the ever will be is the world of Iluvatar, the sort of what goes beyond Middle Earth, the eternity of this world. And we get one of the most memorable meals that follow. I was thinking about this as I was reading it again, that what is emphasized here is the clean hands and clean knives and plates. They've literally come out of the equivalent of the trenches to some respite leave away from the front lines. And that's what I wonder if that is taken directly from experience of what it was felt like to have a decent meal away from the trenches. That's what I thought of as I was reading it. And then we get the final section, which is the return to this conversation. And it starts a bit like the conversation at Bree, where Pippin goes a bit too far. But that role is split between Frodo and Sam in this case. Because Frodo is definitely turning aside tricky subjects, sort of maximizing Boromir's heroism, avoiding things he doesn't want to say. And Faramir is looking for the cracks, because he needs to make a decision about whether or not he should let them go. He hasn't made his mind up. He is not being hasty. But it's interesting that he reveals his mindset here, and the mindset of the people of Gondor facing what looks like an unwinnable battle. He says, "It is long since we had any hope." That's the other line I mentioned that is given to Boromir in Peter Jackson's version. He calls this stage of Gondor's existence a springless autumn. And we go into another very poetic passage. Faramir is such a poet, where he talks about the history of Gondor. And I imagine this is the bit that he might have thought Tolkien might have been considering. Am I saying too much? But he left it in. And I enjoy it just because of the language. Because he has that wonderful image which sets up what Aragorn does right at the end. So again, it does have its purpose. I'm glad he didn't move it into the appendices. He talks about how the sort of kingdom sort of almost committed a kind of suicide in the sense that it became fixated by the wrong things. Kings made tombs more splendid than houses of the living, and counted old names in the rolls of the descent dearer than the names of sons. Childless lords sat in aged halls musing on heraldry. In secret chambers withered men compounded strong elixirs, or in high cold towers asked questions of the stars. And the last king of the line of Anarion had no heir. Again, we're not in the world of natural speech, we're in the world of heightened poetic speech, and it's absolutely beautiful. But it does also convey something important about Gondor. He also goes into the link to Rohan here and talks about how the once high people and the middle people are sort of becoming the same thing. And his love for Rohan, of course, foreshadows the fact that it's Erwin, plot spoiler, who he ends up with. Anyway, he says how they're more like each other, middlemen of the twilight. That word twilight, of course, links to anybody who sort of follows the kind of culture that Tolkien loved, the sort of Twilight of the Gods theme, the sort of Wagner end of, the Ragnarok feel that inspired Tolkien so much. It ends up being the discussion of elves that leads to Sam's downfall. He is the one who does the equivalent of the ring falling on his finger. Because Faramir, he and Faramir discuss this idea that Galadriel is perilously fair. And that leads him to drop his clangor about how Boromir realised when in Lorien what he always wanted, which was the enemy's ring. And you get this moment, which is what it's all been leading to, where the conversations come to a head, where we get the choice. Sam states it. Now's a chance to show your quality. And it's a tension of that moment that just hovers for a second. And Faramir releases it by saying, I am wise enough to know that there are some perils from which a man must flee. And he also goes on to sort of offer some comfort to Sam, saying that his stumble was fated to be because it's helpful. It's meant that Faramir makes up his mind. And seeing that Faramir has resisted taking the ring, Frodo finally is able to say what the plan is. And he collapses because it's been a very, very tense time for him. And he just, he says he's got to go to Mordor, but he doesn't know how to do it. And so he is, that's the moment when he releases the information that he's been holding on to. So we got these moments of like turning points, and this is one. And so Sam and Faramir have a little sort of coda here where Sam says to Faramir that you took a chance and showed your quality the very highest. He gives him the compliment that Faramir reminds him of wizards. And here with the section is wrapped up by Faramir saying, maybe you discern from far away the air of Númenor. Good night. Good night is the end of the chapter. A beautiful, long conversation is that chapter. Quite a long chapter compared particularly to the one that comes after, which is the Forbidden Pool, where we get back onto the main road after our respite. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers Podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.